Great. Hi, everyone. Jessica Fain here. As I mentioned yesterday, I previously worked for the City of New York in the Department of City Planning and the Waterfront Division, which is a small unit. It was 3 people, now it's 5, within a department of 250 people within a City of New York, which I don't even know how many public employees there are, but a whole lot. And since then, I've transitioned to the Science and Resilience Institute at Jamaica Bay, a staff of 5 people total. So it's I was going to share a few thoughts today on sort of the interactions with the science community from my position within the city, and now at the Science and Resilience Institute, how we're working with scientists, and reflect a little bit on those experiences. I think there's 3 ways when I was at city planning that we interacted with scientists. The first, and New York City is really fortunate in this way, was through the New York City panel on climate change. And I imagine most of you know about that panel, but in case you don't, New York City has its own mini version of the IPCC, climate scientists who every year a year after the IPCC releases its projections, they then have a year to provide data to the City of New York on specific projections for New York City. That was established in 2008 and actually solidified into city law in 2012. And so since then, there's a reliable source of data that all city agencies are pointed to in terms of really understanding what climate projections we should be looking at and how we should be thinking about the major climate risks to the city. And it was our role of the Department of City Planning, and specifically within our division, to take those risks and projections and think about how we want to use them for planning purposes, specifically around the built environment, around zoning, and around building code. While those projections are great and they're super helpful, of course they have a range of projections. So a big part of our job was trying to think through what are the relevant projections for embedding into code. While that may not seem like, well, maybe it does seem like a big question, but it is a huge question, because within New York City, for example, there was FEMA flood maps that were on the books before Hurricane Sandy since 1983, and there were 36,000 buildings within the 100-year floodplain. Recently, those flood maps were updated, and now there's 68,000 buildings within that floodplain. And when we layer on the 2050s mid-range projections onto that, then there's 114,000 buildings within the floodplain. So that equates to roughly 800,000 residents that live within the 100-year floodplain within New York City, according to those projections. And so these small decisions to tweak some line of code have huge ramifications across a huge number of people. And so that was a main theme, and something that the city has since incorporated. It has not gone so far as to incorporate sea level rise projection into zoning, but it has taken a look at making sure that when we do adopt these new flood maps, buildings can be what we call be made whole, so that buildings can actually rebuild after a storm at an appropriate elevation, that there's an appropriate amount of freeboard incorporated, and there's discussions now about how to think about sea level rise and whether to include another map or some other type of form to regulate buildings. So that was done after Hurricane Sandy and is continuing to be a big discussion sort of at a citywide level. But then there's also been discussions at a more small-scale neighborhood level. And so the Department of City Planning led an initiative called the Resilient Neighborhoods program, where it looked specifically at small areas of the city and tried to think about how, that presented specific issues. So for example, there are a few areas around Jamaica Bay that we know are at risk not only from the 100-year storm, but also from daily tidal inundation in the not so near future. And actually in some places today, there's tidal inundation happening at spring high tides or certain points of the year. So what different zoning techniques and building code techniques can we incorporate and other planning techniques into those areas to address those risks? Another issue that we looked at in a more fine-grained way was the relationship between affordable housing and these floodplain changes. This study looked specifically at the Lower East Side of New York, where there's a really high concentration of a variety of different affordable housing programs from a wide range of different funding sources and regulatory sources, and looking at what these changes could mean in terms of how we regulate those areas. So those are some of the questions we were dealing with. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit, but some other ways that we engage with scientists were through advisory teams. We'd always, at the beginning of a planning process, pull together an advisory team, and often those are made up of agencies and scientists to help really guide those processes. One project, for example, that I worked on was a study called Urban Waterfront Adaptive Strategies. It was actually funded through a HUD Sustainable Communities grant, and that project basically just aimed to be a toolkit of a range of adaptive strategies that an urban area could use, looking at a variety of land use considerations, as well as environmental and geomorphological considerations as well. And what we did was really just, we did a lot of analysis of existing documents, taking Army Corps of Engineers, shoreline structure reports, going through those, looking at kind of vision competitions and innovative examples from around the world, and really just pulled it all together into one document. And relied a lot on our advisory committee to pull that together. And I don't think it was, I think it's, the value of that report isn't that it's groundbreaking, but that it really just pulled together things in a way that made a lot more people understand these things all in one place. And it had lots of cute little diagrams that we had an intern one summer pull together. And I wish I knew how many times those diagrams have been reproduced in other reports, but it's one of those things that it wasn't breakthrough science, but it really was synthesis that had large-scale ramifications. And then the other way I engaged with scientists was often through students or other academics that somehow found my email or contacted me and wanted an interview, and so, or needed data for some sort. And I found those interactions exciting. It was nice to be engaged with an academic exercise or a student project, but often there was no follow-through, so it was sort of ad hoc and inconsistent. And then I guess there's lots of other ways that we know things besides from the science community. There's a lot of consultant-driven knowledge that's created at the city. There's community-based and anecdotal knowledge. For example, just communities around Jamaica Bay really wanted to rebuild after Hurricane Sandy, whereas certain communities in Staten Island were really willing to take buyouts, and that has nothing to do with something we learned just from knowing communities and listening to them. We work a lot with advocacy groups. The Environmental Justice Alliance, for example, in New York is a major organization that does their own science and has a network of environmental justice agencies, and they have a lot of political clout, as well as other politicians and political networks, as well as other data-driven sources like FEMA flood claims, damage reports from Sandy, sea level rise maps, et cetera. And so since I've transitioned to the Science and Resilience Institute, I'm building on 5 months of experience, so it's kind of limited in terms of what I can share, but here's a few things and ways that we've interacted with scientists. We've hosted events like State of the Bay Symposium, which was an event last spring where it was a 2-day event with 150 people. A range of scientists and agencies presented, and there were breakout sessions. I think it was a really successful event to focus specifically on the Bay. We host and coordinate research. For example, Adam and I were on a phone call this morning talking about an integrated research or integrated modeling project that looks not only at flooding in Jamaica Bay, but also ecological and water quality issues, and pulling all those data sets together. We work on grant proposals jointly with researchers and agency folks. We organize things like, recently we hosted a cross-bay bike tour where we had 30 folks. We biked across the bay and had 5 or 6 stops along the way where a variety of project managers from agencies and community folks kind of spoke about different projects that were going on around the bay. And then finally we have our public agency committee and our stakeholder agency committee, which advise the Institute. And so I guess I have lots of thoughts on what I've heard over the last few days, but I guess just to quickly sum up and give a plug for the profession of city planning, I think it's a field that is highly relevant to a lot of the discussions we've been having, just in the sense that we're trained really to think across disciplines and to think across issues and rely on the expertise of others. And so I think that idea can, and thinking about the field of urban planning as a way to do some of this boundary work is useful. So, thanks.
You made a comment about students and researchers contacting for interviews and whatever other data, and there was no follow-through. Could you just say what that was?
Oh, I guess I just mean that, often you're interviewed for something and you're like, share your results with me, like whenever you're done with your research, and yeah, I'd say half the time you never hear about what happened.
That happens a lot with students. Yeah.
Can you comment on the changing of the floodplain in relation to developers' interests and the insurance industry, in terms of, you could see where all of the adaptation work could lower the insurance risk and lower the rates, but then the definition of floodplain would perhaps be opposed by the developers. And can you comment on that dynamic?
Yeah, definitely. And it's actually even more complex sort of than that, although I think in terms of large developers, they know that they want to build, they want to protect their assets. I don't think they're concerned with, it's their investment too. So higher floodplains, especially for a large scale developer, I don't think presents such a big issue. I think where it presents more of an issue is for the individual homeowner. What's interesting in New York is that the city is actually currently contesting FEMA's most recent flood maps. They did their own independent review on what FEMA provided to the city, and they think the flood maps are actually too extensive. And so they're looking to cut them back, which presents a really kind of interesting, one of the drivers of this, in another study that was conducted, is about the cost of flood insurance. Between recent regulatory reforms to the flood insurance, the cost of flood insurance is going up. And so the threat of flood insurance actually displacing people from their neighborhoods because of the cost of the insurance, not from any actual flood event, is really real in a lot of neighborhoods. And so the city is trying to balance, wanting to have, be proactive in terms of, having buildings build to a certain standard and think about future flooding, but at the same time not wanting to displace neighborhoods because of the increasing cost of flood insurance. So that, I think, is the most pressing kind of issue right now.
A lot of times developers are not actually going to be the ones keeping those buildings too. They're going to be selling them, and so it depends where you are. I think for us, we're finding that developers are wanting to take an existing building and repurpose it and then sell it, and so they don't care as much about what the long-term impact is going to be. And so that's an issue there, and they often don't let the tenants know as well. If there's a person who does hold on to the property, we're trying to make it mandatory that it says on their agreements with their tenants they have to let them know they're in a flood-prone area, but that's really hard to also get through. And the other piece with insurance is with FEMA, the residential area or the residential retrofits, you can only elevate. That's the only thing you can do with residential structures to retrofit for floodplain. And so from an urban planning perspective, it kills the functioning of a urban area when you're saying, let's elevate these buildings 10 feet off the ground, then you have no interaction in the public space whatsoever. And it certainly doesn't work in areas that are older that have row houses or other things like that.